From Pacifica, this is Democracy Now!
There's no president, there's no vice president, there's no prime minister, there is no cabinet. What's your take on the situation, realizing that this is just happening now?
Correct. It just happened. We've obviously seen the reports. Our team is seeking confirmation of all of the reports. We continue to support a peaceful transition.
Upheaval on the Arabian Peninsula as the president and prime minister of Yemen resign following a coup attempt, while King Abdullah of Saudi Arabia dies at the age of 90. We'll get the latest. Then to Ferguson, as the Justice Department is reportedly set to clear Officer Darren Wilson in the shooting death of Michael Brown. And a major decision: the Supreme Court sides with whistleblowers in the case of a federal air marshal who exposed a plan to cut back on security on international flights. And we'll hear why jailed journalist Barrett Brown has been sentenced to 5 years in prison related to the hacking of the private intelligence firm Stratfor, which exposed how the firm spied on activists on behalf of corporations. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. Yemen is facing political collapse following the mass resignations of President Abdurabu Mansour Hadi, his prime minister, and entire cabinet. Thursday's exodus came just hours after Shia Houthi rebels stormed the presidential compound in the capital city of Sana'a. Hadi said he could not continue in office after Houthis allegedly broke a peace deal to retreat from key positions in return for increased political power. We'll have more on the crisis in Yemen just after headlines. King Abdullah bin Abdulaziz of Saudi Arabia has died at the age of 90. King Abdullah was one of the world's wealthiest and most powerful men, controlling a fifth of the known global petroleum reserves. The king's half-brother, Crown Prince Salman, has now assumed the throne. We'll have more on King Abdullah's death and Saudi Arabia's future later in the broadcast. In the United States, Cuba and the United States have wrapped the first round of historic talks in Havana. The two sides met as part of the effort to restore full diplomatic ties for the first time in more than half a century. The head of the U.S. delegation, Assistant Secretary of State Roberta Jacobson, is the highest-ranking U.S. diplomat to enter Cuba in nearly 40 years. Jacobson said while progress was made, there's no timeline for the reopening of a U.S. embassy in Havana. She also said she pressed Cuban counterparts on U.S. concerns about human rights.
I can't tell you exactly when that will happen. We are all working through the issues as quickly as we can, and we will do that as soon as we can resolve all of the functional issues that we need to address. On the issue of human rights, the president has spoken to the issue, and certainly that issue remains central to our conversations. We've made clear that we will continue to raise that issue, and I did discuss that issue today.
Cuban officials have denied human rights issues were addressed, and Cuba has previously criticized the U.S. record. Josefina Vidal, head of the U.S. affairs at the Cuban Foreign Ministry, said Cuba needs several outstanding issues addressed, including the lifting of the embargo and Cuba's removal from the list of countries sponsoring international terrorism.
For our part in the process of these discussions, it's a challenge to say that we have managed to reestablish diplomatic relations between Cuba and the U.S., while our country unfairly remains on the U.S. list of international state sponsors of terrorism. We also say that in order for us to open embassies, it is first necessary to resolve the banking situation faced by the Cuban interest section in Washington, which has gone almost a year without services.
President Obama urged Congress to lift the embargo during a State of the Union address earlier this week. The White House has confirmed President Obama will not meet with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu when he visits the United States in March. Netanyahu will address a joint session of Congress on Iran at the invitation of Republican House Speaker John Boehner. Netanyahu has backed new sanctions on Iran despite President Obama's vow to veto them as he pursues a nuclear deal with Tehran. The White House says Obama will not meet with Netanyahu, in line with protocol not to meet with foreign leaders so close to an election in their home countries. A journalist and activist accused of working with Anonymous has been given a 5-year prison term in order to pay nearly $900,000 in restitution and fines. Barrett Brown was sentenced Thursday after pleading guilty last year to charges of transmitting threats accessory to a cyber attack and obstruction of justice. Supporters say Brown has been unfairly targeted for investigating the highly secretive world of private intelligence and military contractors. We'll have more on his sentencing later in the broadcast. And federal prosecutors have unveiled corruption charges against New York Assembly Speaker Sheldon Silver following his arrest Thursday. Silver is accused of using his law firm to rake in millions of dollars in bribes and kickbacks. U.S. Attorney Preet Bharara said Silver amassed a huge fortune through the abuse of his office.
The complaint charges Speaker Silver in 5 counts with corruptly seeking legal business from a handful of people and entities with significant business or interests before the state, and then corruptly profiting from the legal fees that were paid. All told, we allege that Silver corruptly collected some $4 million in bribes and kickbacks disguised as referral fees. Politicians are supposed to be on the people's payroll, not on secret retainer to wealthy special interests they do favors for.
A Democrat, Sheldon Silver, has been New York Assembly Speaker for over 2 decades. A judge has issued seizure warrants to block him from accessing nearly $4 million spread out over 8 accounts. In brief comments to reporters inside the courthouse, Silver maintained his innocence.
I'm happy the issue is coming to be aired in the legal process, and I am confident that when all the issues are aired, I will be vindicated. Thank you.
New York Assembly Speaker Sheldon Silver is the latest in a series of New York lawmakers to face corruption allegations. His arrest has brought new scrutiny on Governor Andrew Cuomo's decision to abruptly shut down the Anti-Corruption Moreland Commission last year. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman.
And I'm Juan Gonzalez. Welcome to all of our listeners and viewers around the country and around the world. We begin in Yemen, which is teetering on the brink of collapse after the U.S.-backed President Abdul Rabu Mansour Hadi, his prime minister and entire cabinet resigned on Thursday. The exodus came just 24 hours after Shia Houthi rebels stormed the presidential compound in the capital city of Sana'a. Hadi said he could not continue ruling after Houthis allegedly broke a peace deal to retreat from key positions in return for increased political power. The Houthis appear to have major backing from longtime President Ali Abdullah Saleh, the ousted leader who was forced from office in a popular uprising in 2011.
The Obama administration had praised the Yemeni government as being a model for successful counterterrorism partnerships. But on Thursday, the U.S. announced it was pulling more staff out of its embassy in Yemen. Some experts warn the developments in Yemen could result in civil war and help al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula gain more power. Meanwhile, Oxfam's warning more than half of Yemen's population needs aid, and a humanitarian crisis of extreme proportions is at risk of unfolding in the country if instability continues. 10 million Yemenis do not have enough to eat, including 850,000 acutely malnourished children. For more, we go to London, where we're joined by Iona Craig. She's a journalist who is based in Sana'a, Yemen, for 4 years as the Yemen correspondent for the Times of London, was awarded the Martha Gellhorn Prize for Journalism in 2014. Iona, welcome back to Democracy Now! Talk about what has taken place.
I think what we've seen in the last few days is pretty unprecedented in terms of Yemen. And I think what's happened now with Hadi handing in his resignation, the Prime Minister and the Cabinet, is really probably the smartest thing they could have done. They were backed into a corner by the Houthis, and quite literally the Houthis had surrounded Hadi's house. They obviously couldn't and hadn't taken them on militarily in a fight that they were unlikely to be able to win. And so this was the only way for them to turn around to the Houthis and say, no, this is enough. And now we have the prospect of an emergency meeting of the Parliament on Sunday when Hadi's resignation will be put forward. Now, they have the option to reject that resignation, which means that Hadi would still be president after that, unless he then hands his resignation in again within 3 months. So it may actually be that Hadi stays and manages to survive all of this.
And Iona, given the constant turbulence within the country, what's the impact on some of the regional and powers, obviously Iran and the United States and Saudi Arabia?
Well, really, you know, the reason why the international community has been promoting and supporting Hadi is because for them, there wasn't another option. They'd been backing this transition deal from the beginning. It was created initially as Ali Abdullah Saleh signed the deal at the end of 2011 in order to step down. This deal called the GCC deal, but it really originated, and it's an open secret, in Sana'a from the American embassy. And the reason we know that is that the politicians in Yemen that first saw it could tell that it was translated from English. So that transition deal is what the international community have been backing, and that transition deal is really what has brought us to this place today, because it never truly addressed the underlying problems in Yemen. It was all about reshuffling power in order to concentrate on the security issues within Yemen without actually making the changes that Yemenis have been demanding. So issues like the Houthis, who were a marginalized group and persecuted under Ali Abdullah Saleh, the issue of southern succession, they were never truly addressed throughout this period. And now this has come to a head now with the Houthis taking their own action to get what they want. So the international community is partly responsible for the situation that Yemen is now in, but of course their focus still remains on the security issues in Yemen.
I want to turn to comments that President Obama made last summer when he announced additional U.S. military support to fight the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria. In response to a question, President Obama invoked U.S. policy in Yemen as a possible model for Iraq and Syria. This is part of what he said.
You look at a country like Yemen, a very impoverished country, and one that has its own sectarian or ethnic divisions. We do have a committed partner in President Hadi and his government, and we have been able to help to develop their capacities without putting large numbers of U.S. troops on the ground. At the same time as we've got enough CT or counterterrorism capabilities that we're able to go after folks that might try to hit our embassy or might be trying to export terrorism into Europe or the United States.
That was President Obama over the summer. Your response, Iona Craig?
Well, I think this really kind of goes back to what I just mentioned, that the international focus has always been about security in Yemen. So even when Ali Abdullah Saleh was in power, they backed him because they could work with him and, you know, carry out the operations that they wanted to, use drone strikes in Yemen. And there was no plan B. There was no, what will we do if Ali Abdullah Saleh is not there? And similarly then with Hadi, they knew Hadi. He'd been vice president under Ali Abdullah Saleh. It was something that they knew that they could work with. They built on that partnership. And again, now there is no plan B. So if Hadi goes, this leaves them in a position, you know, in a really bad position of who now are they dealing with. As for the issue over the Yemen model, clearly now that's something of a joke, really. The Yemen model has all but collapsed. The fighting against al-Qaeda on the ground has actually been done now by the Houthis, but it's actually made the issue and the problem of al-Qaeda worse in Yemen anyway. The violence being carried out by al-Qaeda has increased hugely since the Houthis took Sana'a in September. But, you know, and again, looking at those Oxfam figures, the underlying problems in Yemen, you have now those figures have gone to 16 million people in need of humanitarian aid. The last figures that came out said 14.7 million out of a population of 25. So whilst the international community focuses on these security issues, you've got an economy that's collapsing, you've got a rising humanitarian crisis, and political issues that haven't been dealt with. So this kind of short-term thinking about the security situation in Yemen is really never going to get to the bottom of the political problems, the economic problems, and the humanitarian issues that all feed into this in the end.
And you mentioned one of the other underlying problems being an ongoing secessionist movement. Most Americans here have short memories. They forget that it wasn't long ago when there was a separate Marxist state, the Democratic Republic of Yemen, in a huge portion of what is now Yemen. Could you talk about that secessionist movement in its current form?
Yes, the southern movement, or al-Haraka al-Janubi, it's known in Yemen, has been around for many years now, technically since 2007. But North and South Yemen were unified in 1990, and then there was a brief civil war in 1994, and the South was very much crushed in that. But this call for succession has been increasing rapidly over the last few years, particularly obviously since 2011. But the international community, again, has failed to really engage with the Southerners. And they particularly reached out to the UK, actually, because obviously the British previously had control of Aden, the southern city, for many years. And they reached out to the international community, and really the international community hasn't engaged with them, mainly because they feel that if they engage with the South, then it's recognising their calls for succession, and they don't want Yemen to break up because they think it'll impact the security situation. So in that void, it's actually Iran that a lot of the time in the South has stepped in and has engaged with the Southerners because nobody else will, and they have increasingly been engaging with them and supporting them. But we've also got a situation now in the South over the last 24 hours since everything's happened in Sana'a, where they are now taking action. There have been big protests in the South today. They have said, put out a message saying they will refuse to take orders now from Sana'a because of what's happening with the Houthis, and it now appears that the Houthis are in charge. But there's a lot of politicking going on in Aden right now. So you've got President Hadi with his supporters and his militiamen and gunmen on the streets. You've also got the Houthis supported by Ali Abdullah Saleh being trying to make gains in Aden as well. So it's going to come to a head in the South, and that looks like it's going to happen sooner rather than later now because of what's happening in Sana'a.
Will Saleh return as president?
Ali Abdullah Saleh?
Yes.
I think that's very unlikely, but I think the chances of Ahmed Ali, his son, returning as president are possible. I think that's distinctly possible. It may not happen in the next week, but when it comes to the time of presidential elections, goodness knows when that will happen now. But I think there is a possibility that Ahmed Ali, his son, could rule Yemen. And right now, for some Yemenis, they would throw up their hands and say, security, some form of stability, some form of governance is better than nothing. They're in a pretty dire situation right now, with an economy that's collapsing and this humanitarian crisis going on at the same time. And people, most of the time, just want stability so they can carry on with their lives.
Iona Craig, we want to thank you very much for being with us. She's speaking to us from London, but she lived for 4 years in Sana'a, in the capital of Yemen, reporting for the Times of London, winner of the Martha Gellhorn Prize for Journalism. As we turn now to Saudi Arabia.
Yes, well, in Saudi Arabia, the funeral for the Saudi king, Abdullah, has begun. He died on Thursday at the age of 90. His brother Salman will now become king of the oil-rich monarchy. The White House announced Vice President Joe Biden would travel to Saudi Arabia to offer condolences. King Abdullah was one of the closest U.S. allies in the region. In a statement, President Obama praised him, saying, quote, as a leader, he was always candid and had the courage of his convictions. One of those convictions was his steadfast and passionate belief in the importance of the U.S.-Saudi relationship as a force for stability and security in the Middle East and beyond.
While President Obama described Abdullah as a force of stability in the Middle East, analysts, many accused Abdullah of turning the uprising in Syria into a proxy war with Iran. In 2010, WikiLeaks published U.S. diplomatic cables which identified Saudi Arabia as the world's largest source of funds for Islamist militant groups. King Abdullah also sent tanks to help squash pro-democracy uprisings in neighboring Bahrain. Saudi Arabia recently came under criticism for its treatment of imprisoned blogger Raif Badawi, who was sentenced to 10 years in prison and 1,000 lashes to be carried out at a rate of 50 per week for charges including insulting Islam. He runs a political blog, or did, until he was imprisoned. For more on the future on King Abdullah and the future of Saudi Arabia, we're joined via Democracy Now! Video stream by Toby Jones, Associate Professor of History and Director of Middle East Studies at Rutgers University. He's also the author of Desert Kingdom, How Oil and Water Forged Modern Saudi Arabia, previously the International Crisis Group's political analyst of the Persian Gulf. Toby Jones, welcome back to Democracy Now! Talk about the death of King Abdullah.
Well, Abdullah's death, of course, marks a transition. It's getting a lot of attention. I think, as you pointed out in the lead up here, his record is not quite as positive or rosy as a lot of people are reflecting upon this morning. He came to power formally in 2005, celebrated as a potential reformer, as somebody who would modernize and lead the kingdom forward. But it turns out he's largely failed on every one of those measures. He's turned the clock back in terms of inciting sectarianism at home and supporting the forces of radicalism abroad. Or if we want to read this in some slightly more benign way, he's at least not cracked down on the domestic forces at home that have sought to incite things like sectarianism. He burned bridges with Iraq. He saw the Arab Spring, the uprising in Syria, as an opportunity to challenge both Iran and Assad's power there, knowing full well what the possibilities of blowback and the rise of a kind of new regional terrorism might be. They supported instability in Yemen. They've crushed pro-democracy forces in Bahrain. Look, Abdullah is somebody who was well-liked in the West. He might have been admired by a large section of Saudi society, but his record is one that's consistent with his predecessors. It's at odds with democracy, with human rights, and with all of the things that we're supposed to value.
And about that last point, Professor Jones, what is the state of human rights and democracy in the Saudi kingdom?
Well, it's as bad as it's ever been. You mentioned Badawi in the lead up here being sentenced to a long prison term, and of course now subject to flogging publicly, 1,000 lashes. This might seem outlandish, but this is sort of common practice in Saudi Arabia. Its prisons are full of political prisoners. They have been for quite a long time, including Islamists, suspected terrorists, as well as liberals and others who champion the cause of reform and human rights. There's been a steady string of arrests and detentions over the last few years. We pay attention now because of the crude kind of terrible nature of what's involved in public beheadings and this kind of medieval punishment of lashing people for speaking their minds. But this has been going on in Saudi Arabia for quite a long time. It's worth remembering that in 2002, 2003, Abdullah, when he was crown prince, although not formally the king, was nevertheless still in a position of political primacy, became a darling of the reform lobby and the kind of the what we might call the moderate political wing of Saudi Arabia's domestic political society. He was seen as a reformer. He was embraced by a broad cross-section of folks who believed that Saudi Arabia, following 9/11, following the decade of the 1990s in which there was a kind of brutal politics and a crackdown on dissent, that he was going to be the person who spearheaded a period of liberal opening. And it turns out that he turned against all of his domestic allies. When he saw opportunities to crush and push back against those who might challenge Saudi political primacy, he did so, and he did so as crudely as any of his predecessors did. He was not a benevolent dictator. He was a dictator.
Can you talk about the man who will succeed him, King Salman? There is some information, or is it rumors, that he has dementia?
Well, look, a lot of people claim to have insight into the internal politics of the royal family, and I would caution against saying that we know too much. Salman is not a young man. He's at least 79, if not older than that. So he's been he's been around for quite a long time. Who knows how long his reign will be? If he is suffering from health issues, the royal family is not going to let us know too much about that. There has been speculation that he's suffering from dementia. It's likely that his reign will be a short one, and that there are powers behind the throne that will make sure that the interests of the royal family will be protected. Much like Abdullah and his predecessor Fahd, the family protects itself. There is an arrangement likely in place in which the king is the first amongst equals. Nobody can act too radically or too out of step with the interests of the family more broadly. So Salman's reign will be probably very consistent and similar to that of Abdullah's. He'll be a figurehead. He will likely wield some kind of influence, as will those who are closest to him, as will his successor, the current crown prince, who is probably about a decade younger, Mukran. But the reality here, and I think one of the things we get caught up in is we get caught up in the politics of succession in Saudi Arabia, and will there be a changing of the guard that leads to some fundamental transformation? And the odds are very low that that's going to happen. The royal family's interests are in protecting themselves first, their privilege second, and making sure that there are limited challenges to their authority. They're very good at this, and they have been for over half a century.
And the role of the Saudi family or the Saudi elite in the continuing financing of jihadists around the world?
Well, I mean, Saudi Arabia is, of course, a wellhead for a certain kind of ideological thinking and production. There's a lot of talk about Wahhabism and the similarities between what is the official orthodoxy of the of the Saudi state and groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIS and others. And I think those ideological connections matter. There are certainly operators on the ground. There is support within Saudi mosques for precisely these kinds of networks. The Saudi state is in a much more difficult, and the royal family in a much more difficult position. They view, I think we have to be careful here, I think they view the regional political landscape through the lens of kind of good old-fashioned geopolitics. And they see Iran as a rival. They see Assad as a pawn in all of that game. And they understand that they have a kind of limited playbook, that there are kind of natural alliances with which they can forge mutual interests and cooperation. And the Islamists happen to be among those. But I don't think the royal family is necessarily an ideological actor in the same way that some of the preachers and clerics in Saudi Arabia are. But they reach out because they have to these networks. They're dealt a certain hand, and they play the game in the way that they best can. But this is a dangerous proposition. It was that way in Afghanistan in the 1980s. It was that way in Iraq after 2003, where the Saudis forge alliances, or they at least allow those that sort of on the margins of the government to fund and support networks that are also simultaneously dangerous to the regime itself. That's why they're building a big fence on their border with Iraq. On the one hand, they'd like to see ISIS do damage in Syria, but they don't want to see it come home. But look, over the long term, this is an unsustainable, untenable proposition. The Saudis are eventually going to have to deal. They're going to have to reckon with the blowback from Syria and Iraq. They'd like to postpone it as long as possible, but it's likely inevitable. And the relationship between Saudi Arabia and the United States, Toby Jones. Well, this is a longstanding and complicated one. It's often framed, as Obama mentioned, or as others will likely remark today, that it's framed through the lens of security and stability, and that certainly matters from the perspective of both Saudi and American policymakers. If we peel back the layers of what this means, though, it's not always clear. It's not as though the Saudis have any power to really shape the region or defend their interests militarily. They're largely dependent on the United States for security assurances. The U.S. has happily projected its military power into the Persian Gulf since at least the early 1970s, if not earlier than that. I think what this really comes down to is that the Saudis are the world's most important oil producer. They have been for quite a long time. For that reason, they've been in the American political orbit since at least the late 1930s, and that oil functions in important ways. It functions because it's the Americans see it as important to the global economy, to our own domestic political economic health, and we see Saudi Arabia as an important player in that respect. But oil wealth also does a lot of other things. It gets recycled to the American economy, especially with the purchase of weapons. And these all become entangled with Saudi Arabia. Our relationship is not just about providing security for oil. It's about maintaining a certain kind of strategic and economic relationship that profits both sides. Toby Jones, I want to thank you for being with us, Associate Professor of History and Director of Middle East Studies at Rutgers University, author of Desert Kingdom, How Oil and Water Forge Modern Saudi Arabia. This is Democracy Now! When we come back, we'll talk Ferguson. What about the Justice Department not bringing civil rights charges against the police officer who killed Mike Brown? And then we'll talk about a Supreme Court decision you might not have learned about this week, a major decision on behalf of whistleblowers. Stay with us.
Why? Omar Farouk Tekbilek, here on Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez.
We turn now to news that the Justice Department does not plan to bring civil rights charges against police officer Darren Wilson for shooting unarmed African-American teenager Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri. On Wednesday, the New York Times reported Attorney General Eric Holder will have the final say, but will almost certainly side with investigators who are recommending no charges. A wider Justice Department probe into Ferguson police over reports of racial profiling in traffic stops and use of excessive force remains underway. Meanwhile, a judge has rejected an NAACP Legal Defense Fund request for a new grand jury to consider criminal charges against Wilson. The group raised concerns over the actions of prosecutor Bob McCullough, including his decision to let a witness provide false testimony. All
this comes as President Obama made a single mention of Ferguson in his State of the Union address Tuesday, prompting activists to release their own video on the state of the black union. This is a clip.
We recognize that not even a black president will pronounce our truths. We must continue the task of making America uncomfortable with institutionalized racism in hopes that together we can reimagine what is possible and build a system that is designed for blackness to thrive.
For more on the news that the federal government does not plan to file civil rights charges against police officer Darren Wilson for shooting Michael Brown in Ferguson, we're joined by Vincent Warren, Executive Director of the Center for Constitutional Rights. Vince, welcome back to Democracy Now! Were you surprised?
Not terribly surprised. It's very disappointing because I think a range of people want to have some measure of accountability. But when you actually look at the federal civil rights laws, it's a much harder and higher burden for them to prove these types of charges. They're going to have to essentially show that Darren Wilson intended to violate Mike Brown's civil rights. And there are ways that they can do that by looking at the totality of the evidence, looking at what he said. But I think their view is the evidence just is probably not enough to support that higher burden of proving an intent to do something based on race or to violate his civil rights in that way. It's the challenge.
And what about the ongoing investigation of Ferguson by the Justice Department?
Well, the Department of Justice has two options. One is the criminal route, which it looks like it's not going to happen specifically with respect to Darren Wilson. But they also have other options, which are civil lawsuits against the Ferguson Police Department for pattern and practice of activities that violate civil rights, excessive force and things like that. So that's clearly something that they're intending to move forward. Beyond that, the Brown family also has the ability to file a civil lawsuit, which is not outstanding for the justice that people want, but it certainly is a remedy that could send a very strong financial message.
On this issue of intent, I mean, even if he didn't that morning when he got up say, I want to violate his rights, or even 5 minutes before, once he did that, why is that not sufficient?
Well, there are a range of things in life that happen that it's difficult to prove after the fact. And with this situation, you know, it's not, the proof doesn't require him to say the N-word right as he pulls the trigger. However, and you can look at the facts and the circumstances. So whether Mike Brown's hands were up or not would matter. Whether Mike Brown was running away or running towards would matter. So those are the totality of the circumstances that they can begin to look at. However, I think their take is, based on that information that they have, it's going to be very hard for them to issue an indictment in the federal court that would sustain this type of charge, unfortunately.
And what's been the impact nationwide following Ferguson in terms of attempts by local communities to reform the police abuse situation in their own communities? We just recently, for instance, this week, Governor Cuomo announced new measures during his State of the State address Wednesday. He announced his reforms that could lead to the appointment of special prosecutors in cases where police kill unarmed suspects and a grand jury fails to indict the officer. This is Governor Cuomo.
I will appoint an independent monitor who will review police cases where a civilian dies and no true bill is issued, and the independent monitor can recommend a special prosecutor be appointed. The independent monitor should have access to the grand jury information, which will be protected, but this way the independent monitor can actually make an intelligent recommendation because they'll have all the evidence and they'll have all the facts.
That was Governor Cuomo at his State of the State. Your analysis of his proposals and what's going on in other parts of the country as well.
Well, yeah, the Ferguson situation has everything to do with what's going on in different parts of the country. With respect to that particular proposal, I actually was part of a meeting with Attorney General Schneiderman of New York, who proposed a similar measure in which his office would be appointed to be able to look at these things more independently than local prosecutors who work with police officers would. This, I think, is a step in the right direction. And it really points to the larger issue and that the protesters are talking about, is that we're talking systemic failure. What's happening in grand juries around the country, and even in terms of the federal prosecution, the system is not keeping up with the current nature and tenor of the civil rights violations that are happening with police departments. We need protesters out there to push that political agenda to make sure that Black Lives Matter, and then we need to have smart reforms like this one that shift the dynamic so that the system is not trying to reform itself.
Vince Warren, I want to thank you for being with us. Vince Warren is Executive Director of the Center for Constitutional Rights. As we move on now to our next story.
Well, a journalist accused of working with the hacking group Anonymous has been sentenced to 5 years in prison in order to pay nearly $900,000 in restitution and fines. Barrett Brown, held in custody since September 2012, pleaded guilty to charges of transmitting threats accessory to a cyber attack and obstruction of justice for interfering with the execution of a search warrant. After his sentencing on Thursday, Brown released a satirical statement saying, quote, "Good news. The U.S. government decided today that because I did such a good job investigating the cyber industrial complex, they're now going to send me to investigate the prison industrial complex."
Before Barrett Brown's path crossed with the FBI, he frequently contributed to Vanity Fair, The Huffington Post, The Guardian, and other news outlets. In 2009, Barrett Brown created Project PM, which was, quote, dedicated to investigating private government contractors working in the secretive fields of cybersecurity, intelligence, and surveillance. He was particularly interested in the documents leaked by WikiLeaks and Anonymous. In the documentary We Are Legion, Barrett Brown explains the importance of information obtained by hackers.
Some of the most important things that have had the most far-reaching influence and have been the most important in terms of what's been discovered, not just by Anonymous, but by the media in the aftermath, is a result of hacking. That information can't be obtained by the traditional journalistic process, or it can't be obtained or won't be obtained by a congressional committee or a federal oversight committee. For the most part, that information has to be, obtained by hackers.
In 2011, the group Anonymous hacked into the computer system of the private security firm H.B. Gary Federal and disclosed thousands of internal emails. Barrett Brown has not been accused of being involved in the hack itself, but he did read and analyze the documents, eventually crowdsourcing the effort through the Project PM. One of the first things he discovered was a plan to tarnish the reputations of WikiLeaks and sympathetic journalist Glenn Greenwald, then with The Guardian. Brown similarly analyzed and wrote about the millions of internal company emails from Stratfor Global Intelligence that were leaked on Christmas Eve 2011. Shortly thereafter, the FBI acquired a warrant for his laptop and the authority to seize any information from his communications, or in journalism parlance, his sources. In September 2012, armed agents barged into Brown's apartment in Dallas, Texas, handcuffed him face down on the floor. He has been in prison ever since.
For more on the sentencing of Barrett Brown, we go to Dallas, Texas, to speak with Kevin Gallagher, the director of the Free Barrett Brown Support Network. He attended Brown's sentencing hearing on Thursday. Kevin Gallagher is a writer, activist, systems administrator, currently working for Freedom of the Press Foundation. He recently wrote a piece for the New York Observer called "Don't Believe What the Government Says About Barrett Brown." Kevin Gallagher, welcome to Democracy Now! Talk about who Barrett Brown is, the sentencing yesterday, and what it means for freedom of the press, and talk about just what he did.
Certainly. Well, thank you for having me on, Amy. So, as you provided in that very good background there, Barrett Brown is a journalist activist who became known through his work with Anonymous, and he landed on the radar of the FBI through his investigations of the private intelligence contracting industry. His case has gone on for over 2 years now, and his sentencing was delayed several times. Finally, yesterday, in the second half of the sentencing hearing, the judge imposed a sentence. It was really quite extraordinary because the judge essentially agreed with the government on most of the sentencing enhancements which they had proposed, overruling the defense's objections. he did not seem to understand what the public impact of this case would be. He dismissed out of hand the mitigating factors of Brown's mental state when he made the videos. In fact, he was more concerned about the chilling effects on FBI agents in conducting their investigations than any chilling effects on journalists who paste links. I think any journalists in the United States should be concerned about the precedent that this sets for people who share information, people who report on hacking, or those who use hackers as sources, or who do computer security research and things of that nature. But even just anyone who shares a link without knowing what exactly is in it. They've set an unreasonable expectation here that you should know that for certain that the link you're sharing doesn't contain stolen credit cards or things of that nature before doing so.
And what is the importance of the information that he provided about Stratfor? Who is Stratfor Intelligence and its role?
Well, yes, Stratfor is a private intelligence firm. They're much like a private version of the CIA. They do global analysis and generate reports which people subscribe to and receive these reports. As a result of the emails that were leaked to WikiLeaks, there's several things came out of there. They were conducting surveillance of Occupy Wall Street, going after activists in Bhopal, India, and even targeting PETA at the behest of Coca-Cola. Brown actually did most of his work on the H.B. Gary emails and looking at things like persona management and the Team Themis scandal, which you mentioned, more than he had a chance really to look into Stratfor.
I wanted to go to that issue of H.B. Gary. By analyzing the information from the H.B. Gary hack, Barrett Brown discovered the security firm's plan to undermine journalist Glenn Greenwald's defense of WikiLeaks. One slide read, "Without the support of people like Glenn, WikiLeaks would fold." H.B. Gary intended to spread disinformation to discredit both Glenn Greenwald and WikiLeaks. In the documentary We're Legion, the director spoke to former H.B. Gary CEO Aaron Barr about these plans.
It seems like you're trying to attack a journalist here.
Yeah, and I don't want to talk too much more about Glenn Greenwald, but other than, what I previously said is, there was never an intent to attack journalists, not on my part. Nor I guess I should say I should generalize that and to say that I would never just outwardly attack a journalist, other than if I felt that there was a journalist in my mind that was acting unethically. That that is that's a fair game for having a public discussion about.
That's former H.B. Gary CEO Aaron Barr in the documentary We Are Legion. Of course, Glenn Greenwald would go on to win the Pulitzer Prize. Kevin Gallagher, the significance of what Barrett Brown did in relation to H.B. Gary, and as we wrap up, what the sentencing says to people in this country.
Well, it says that they should be very concerned about the state of press freedom in this country. The U.S. has dropped in their ranking on press freedom, as told by Reporters Without Borders, in fact, due to this case specifically. As far as H.B. Gary, one of the biggest things that Brown found in there was a program called Romas Coin, which was this mobile phone application proposal to target the Arab world. And, this, to me, this is on par with any report that you've seen from the Snowden documents. And this was discovered 2 years before Snowden even came forward.
And that sentencing, he will spend how long in jail?
Well, he's been sentenced to 63 months, which is the maximum under the guidelines which the judge calculated according to the offense levels. But he could be out within 1 or 2 years if he completes an in-prison drug rehab program. And, the bottom line is this is not going to deter him from doing his work, which is writing, making people laugh through his hilarious column, and investigating government wrongdoing.
Well, Kevin Gallagher, we want to thank you for joining us, writer, activist, and systems administrator, currently working for Freedom of the Press Foundation, also director of the Free Barrett Brown support network advocacy group and legal defense fund. Yes, Kevin Gallagher attended Brown's sentencing hearing on Thursday in Dallas. This is Democracy Now! When we come back, a major decision from the Supreme Court this week on whistleblowers. Stay with us.
Dissertation on a complex situation, money and intimidation, and mass graves make strong foundations for the giant corporations that own all the TV stations, telling us to take vacations to their big theme park plantations rather than to hearts of nations where we might meet people on the street who say, I don't want my MTV cause it brought Viva to its knees, and Mom and Pop are begging, please, globalization's killing me, while we think that they think they need all of the things we think we need, like Martha Stewart shams and cheats and sugar-free powdered iced tea, vanilla, Coke, lemon, Pepsi, Friends episodes.
Vive la persistance by Kimya Dawson. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez.
We turn now to a major Supreme Court decision upholding the right of federal employees to become whistleblowers. The case centered on a Transportation Security Administration federal air marshal named Robert McLean. In July 2003, McLean revealed to a reporter from MSNBC that the Department of Homeland Security had decided to stop assigning air marshals to certain long-distance flights in order to save money, despite warnings of a potential plot to hijack U.S. airplanes. MSNBC's report on the story sparked outcry, and the policy was quickly reversed. McLean was fired 3 years later after admitting to being the source of the article. He sued, beginning a multi-year legal battle.
Earlier this week, the Supreme Court, in a 7-2 decision, ruled on Robert McLean's behalf. At issue was whether McLean's actions could be protected by the U.S. Whistleblower Protection Act, a law that protects employees if a disclosure exposes unlawful conduct, gross mismanagement, or threats to public safety. Robert McLean joins us now from Orange, California. We're also joined by attorney Neil Katyal, who argued McLean's case before the Supreme Court. Neil Katyal is the former acting Solicitor General of the United States. Well, let's first go to Robert McLean, but go back to 2003. Tell us why you decided to do what you did. You were an air marshal.
Well, initially, I thought it was a mistake because 2 days before, we had been given an unprecedented emergency briefing that we were going to be attacked by al-Qaeda hijackers smuggling weapons onto aircraft and targeting overseas flights. So, and we never had such a briefing. So when 2 days later, we get this text message to immediately cancel all of our hotel reservations, it made no sense. So
that meant that you would no longer be flying overseas, air marshals.
Pretty much the way it would have affected any flight that was about 3.5 hours long.
So what'd you do?
First, I called my office to find out what's with this text message we all got, and everybody got it across the country. And the supervisor told me that the agency had no more money and they were going to cancel these missions indefinitely. Subsequent investigations by the Inspector General and the U.S. Government Accountability Office concluded that it was going to last until the fiscal year. So it would have been 2 months until more funding came to the agency.
Now, what did you do subsequent to that to go through the normal procedures that you would have to appeal a decision like this?
I called a hotline for the Inspector General's office, and they asked me where I was located. So they directed me to a office in San Diego, California, where they told me that they were simply an audit office and that they did not handle the type of disclosure that I was giving them. So they gave me a number for the Oakland office, where I spoke to a criminal investigator who had been, according to what he told me, he was detailed from the Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA, and I explained to him what was happening, and he actually sympathized, but he said there's really nothing that can be done. These things happen. Agencies run out of money, so this is there's nothing that he could do, and gave me sort of a lecture. Don't press this. You got a long career ahead of you. You might. We discussed our ages, and he said just to walk away.
But you didn't. Tell us what you did.
After that, I looked up. There were two journalists that were doing really good and very responsible. And I flew myself, so I didn't want to put myself in danger and the public that I was serving in danger. So I was careful to find these two journalists. One was unavailable, and the other I got through. He explained to me that he was in touch with senior members in Congress who ended up being Hillary Clinton, John Kerry, Barbara Boxer, and Hal Rogers. And he said he was in touch with them, and he also verified that air marshals from all across the country got the same message, and the story broke out a few hours later.
What was the reaction within the agency once the story broke?
Immediately, the agency denied it. They said that's not what we're doing, and eventually, at the end of the day, they issued a press statement that they had made a mistake.
You would later be fired for when it was revealed that you were the source of this information?
That's correct.
On what grounds?
I was charged with one charge of unauthorized sensitive security information.
This is after senators held news conference, an investigation was done, the policy was almost immediately reversed.
Yes, the plan was to go in effect 5 days later, so it never went into effect.
But you were fired 3 years later when they found out who did this.
That's correct.
I'd like to ask Neil Katyal the importance of this case and the repercussions that resulted from the whistleblowing here.
Yeah, I mean, it's an obviously incredibly important case. Let me start with who it's important to. I mean, it's obviously important to Robert and his family. Whistleblowing is a really hard thing to do, and Robert, for a decade, has been living with the consequences of it. And, you know, the Chief Justice's opinion for the Supreme Court, a 7-2 sweeping decision in Robert's favor, finally gives him a measure of relief from what has been a really unfortunate ordeal. So that's just on the personal level. But on the kind of long-term systemic level, this is a really important decision. I mean, Congress enacted the Whistleblower Act in 1978 for precisely this kind of thing, because they knew that government agencies engage in, you know, wasteful spending or sometimes far, far worse, mistakes that damage our national security. And it's up to people who are employees like Robert to do the right thing and come forward and to say, hey, you can't do this. This is wrong. And what the administration and the TSA argued in this case was, no, we can write our own regulations to punish people like Robert, despite what Congress said. And what the U.S. Supreme Court said in an opinion that transcended all kind of political lines or anything like that, 7 justices signing on to it, they said, no, the whole point of the Whistleblower Act is to prevent agencies from doing this kind of stuff, these shenanigans like they did to Robert. And, look, I don't mean to malign the TSA here in general. There's a lot of very responsible people there, as there are in all agencies. But I think Congress in 1978, when they wrote the rules, understood, yeah, there are a lot of responsible people, but sometimes there are some who aren't. And that's why we need the act. And so, this is the U.S. Supreme Court in a pretty dramatic fashion coming forward to say, hey, agencies, you're wrong on this stuff. It's really Congress that set the ground rules here, and they protect people like Robert.
Neil Katyal, the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit ruled in Robert McClain's favor. But the Obama administration appealed to the Supreme Court, arguing the Federal Circuit had made a serious legal mistake that would embolden further disclosures by federal employees and could put lives at stake. Can you respond?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, the U.S. Supreme Court rejected the Obama administration's argument here. And I should say I don't hold any blame for the Obama administration in bringing the case to the Supreme Court. It was an obviously important case to bring. Don Verrilli, the Solicitor General, I think, made an understandable decision to bring the case to the Supreme Court. It's one that, I disagree with personally, but, reasonable people can have different views of that. But at the end of the day, it's the U.S. Supreme Court and its decision 2 days ago that controls this, not what the Obama administration said when asking the court to hear the case. And what the U.S. Supreme Court said is, hey, agencies cannot be trusted with this measure of responsibility to allow them to kind of do an end run around the Whistleblower Act. The majority opinion, the Chief Justice's opinion, said basically that's kind of like the fox guarding the hen house, and it can't possibly be. And it's an interesting thing because in this day and age, I think so many people out there in the country think, oh, it's the Robert Supreme Court, it's political in one way or another, all these decisions are 5-4. This is a really good illustration of how this Supreme Court doesn't always act politically one way or another, that they come together in a bipartisan fashion. And it's a good reminder. I mean, last year, the Chief Justice did something, and his colleagues did something really kind of surprising. They agreed in roughly 2/3 of the cases unanimously. You'd have to go back to the year 1940 to find that level of agreement. In Robert's case, wasn't totally unanimous. It was 7-2, but it was still, 7 justices ruling against the government in a national security case. That's a pretty rare thing to happen.
And I'm wondering, in terms of the impact of this case on whistleblowers, not just in the federal government, is that potentially this case could potentially be cited because at local, state government levels, there are government employees who see major problems arising within their agencies, sometimes affecting public safety. Will this embolden them at the local level as well?
Well, I mean, I think different states have different whistleblower acts, and they work in different ways. The Chief Justice's opinion was careful to really talk about the Federal Whistleblower Act and federal employees. So, strictly speaking, as a legal matter, I don't think that it changes the game with respect to states. But I think what Robert did here is inspiring to all Americans. I mean, I don't think that whistleblowing is something that should be done lightly. It should only be reserved for a circumstance like this. But in a circumstance like this, in which, the public's lives are in danger and the agency is doing the wrong thing, I think this U.S. Supreme Court said someone like Robert's got to come forward. That's what the system depends on. And
the implications, we just have 10 seconds for Ed Snowden.
There are no implications for Snowden. I think that's a very, very different case.
And let me end with Robert. What does this mean for you? You were fired years ago. Do you get reinstated?
Well, I believe not only the Merit Systems Protection Board in its last decision agreed that I had a reasonable belief of wrongdoing occurring, but also the TSA. When I made my...
We have 4 seconds.
That's all I can say.
But thank you very much. A very important case. Robert McLean and Neil Katyal. That does it for our show. We're headed to Sundance for the film festival. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez.